So I'm really excited to welcome you all to this talk. I'm Janette, one of the co-chairs for Gatty this year, and we'll have MK Long to discuss her work from Cornell. But first we'll have Bruno Shirley to introduce. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Harry. It's really exciting to get to introduce MK's Gatty. MK has asked me to keep this super brief and to not talk about her many and varied achievements. So all I'm going to say is that MK is currently a PhD candidate in Asian literature, religion, and culture here at Cornell with Professor Anne Blackburn. She is writing up her dissertation in the final stages. And she is, above all, a dear friend, colleague, and mentor to all of us in both here in the Department of Asian Studies and in the Southeast Asia program. So I am sure that you are all as excited as I am to hear her talk about her research today. Over to you.
Thank you, Bruno. Let me get my screen shared. Okay, are we good? Okay.
We're good.
All right. I'm so delighted to be part of the Gatty series this semester. Thank you, Bruno, for the introduction, and my thanks to Tamar, Harry, Ava, Aaron, and James for the invitation and for the administrative support. I'm only sorry to be doing this over Zoom because it means my SEEP comrades don't get free lunch, but it is what it is. I hope to see you again on campus soon. It's truly a privilege today to be joined by so many people who have guided and supported me in this work. I feel especially conscious of how to express my gratitude on this occasion because gratitude is in fact the topic of my talk today. In particular, the sense of debt that accompanies feelings of gratitude, the feeling that because of what someone has done for you, you must do something in return for them. In Burma, debts of gratitude are owed especially to one's parents, and they are best repaid by dedicating merit to parents. But filial debts are not just incurred by the children of parents. They can make sisters into mothers and strangers into sons. Bonds of kinship can be created, reworked, and reinforced by debts of gratitude. Allow me to say here at the outset that whatever merit I may have generated in the course of this research and writing, I offer it all to my parents, without whom none of this could have proceeded. Thank you. Introducing a 1992 biography of the Buddhist nun, or in Burmese, the thilashin Do Dhammasari, her biographer, a monk called Ashin Gothita, discloses how he became invested in his biographical project. He says, if Do Dhammasari had not come into being, then the Dhammanada monastery could not have come into being. If the Dhammanada monastery had not come into being, then the Mingun Tipitaka Sayadaw could never have emerged and come to prominence. And if the Mingun Sayadaw had not come into being, just like this, one after another, these thoughts came to my mind until at last I realized a library to commemorate Do Dhammasari, benefactor of Dhammanada Monastery and benefactor of Tipitaka Sayadaw, must come about quickly. In this opening confession, the trail of question marks separated by ellipses mirrors the rhythm of Gothita's thoughts, a chain of questions linked by reflective pauses. If, then, if, then. It also marks a void of stunned recognition of the conditions of possibility that enabled Gothita's own career and brought him close to his teacher, the Mingun Tipitaka Sayadaw, whose rise, Gothita discovers, depended on another. This punctuated pause might lead readers to imagine not only Gothita's personal past, but also the stakes of their shared future. Readers who are devotees of Mingun Sayadaw, or at least familiar with his role in 20th century Buddhist projects of national and pan-Asian significance, might fill in that void with their own anxious astonishment. What of our nation? What of the Buddhasasana? Where would we be now, and where would we be headed were it not for him? And, as Gothita has realized, were it not for her, Do Dhammasari. Gothita's experience of finding himself implicated in a continually unfolding chain of actions and relations quickens his resolve to accomplish his project. He intends his readers to feel their lives and livelihoods are at stake because, as he performs for us, The feeling of gratitude for and dependence on the efforts of people in the past entails an obligation to do something in return. In Burmese, this feeling and action of gratitude is Jesu, a Burmese compound that signifies gratitude and also merit, benefit, and virtue. It is an intrinsically relational term that suggests a deed offered in service to others that requires return. The filial associations with the term are such that one's benefactors or Jesu Shin, keepers of Jesu, are often identified with kin terms as parents. For example, here in the lower photo of Dhammasari and Mingun Sayadaw, taken from Gautama's biography, the two are identified in the caption as Tatana Uken and Tatana Miken, father and mother of the Sasana, benefactors of Buddhist teachings and institutions in Burma. But the pair are also more commonly identified as mother and son, a bond better portrayed by their postures in the upper photo. And not because of any biological relationship, but because of Mingun Sayadaw's debts to Dhammasari as his patron and counselor. Continually compounding acts of Jesu and their repayment have the capacity to create, rework, and buttress ties of kinship, drawing and keeping people together over time. As much as Dhammasari's biographer says he owes to her, the biography tends to digress into discussion of the life of Gautama's own teacher. For him, Dhammasari remains instrumental to the achievements of the Sayadaw, whose presence sometimes overshadows Dhammasari as the subject of her own biography. Would this have been any different if the biography had been written by someone who knew her while she was living, by a woman, by a thilashin? My dissertation work has focused on biographical writing about thilashin, composed by their peers, friends, and students. In particular, a volume of biographies published in 1982 to commemorate the first 4 Seyaji, or head teachers of a nunnery in central Burma called Kimithika. The volume was composed by the 4th Seyaji herself, Doa Zanawadi. Zanawadi completed the volume in 1979 in recognition and celebration of the upcoming 75th anniversary of the nunnery's founding in 1905. At the time, she too was 75 years old, and she had lived as a thilashin at Kimithika for 60 years. In my dissertation, I offer thematic readings of each of the 4 biographies that explore the ways thilashin harness the rhetorical force of relationships. That is, how thilashin express belonging to one another, how they sustain and portray institutional affiliations, and how they invite and persuade others, like monastic benefactors and lay patrons, to participate in their projects. Today, I will focus on the volume's first biography, that of Kimithika's founder, Doa Midawadi. After sketching the arc and some significant moments of her biographical narrative, I focus on how Zanawadi, her student and biographer, goes about demonstrating Midawadi's skill in harnessing debts of gratitude to initiate and sustain Kimithika. My analysis is also attuned to how and why this biographical project may have been useful to Zanawadi as one of Midawadi's successors, and what thilashin can teach us about the everyday practices of reproducing Buddhist institutions. Born in 1862, Midawadi grew up in a small village near the Nyambintha railway station, about 30 kilometers north of Taungu. Taungu was an important economic hub and a strategic position for British troops in the lead up to the annexation of Upper Burma in 1885. The railway line used to locate Midawadi's natal village that ran from Rangoon to Taungu to Mandalay did not yet exist when she was born, but it would become the first overland rail service to connect Upper and Lower Burma, a route that would prove crucial in the progression of Midawadi's career. As a young girl, Midawadi studied with her older brother under the direction of their mother's brother, the head monk of a village monastery financed and donated by her parents. When her brother was 12, he initiated as a novice monk and continued studying with his uncle. Midawadi, age 10, was asked to stay home to assist with housework in the family's trade business. When she was about 13, her parents passed away, and Midawadi moved into the household of her older sister, May, already married and with children of her own. By 15, Midawadi was dissatisfied with housework and childcare. She made up her mind to initiate as a thilashin so that she could return to her uncle's monastery and her studies. Her sister pleaded with her. In married life, The troubles of a husband, the troubles of children, they are no small thing. With a son and 2 daughters, I've many mouths to feed. You know all of this. Now you're 15, you're young. My mind is not at ease. Business is not going well. Please just wait. So she did wait 3 more years. In 1880, at age 18, Medawati initiated as a thilashin in the midst of her brother's full ordination. At first, Medawati sought to go directly to Tangu in eager pursuit of scriptural studies, but this time her uncle persuaded her to wait again to let the family's finances recover following their sponsorship of her brother's ordination. 3 years later, Medawati moved to Tangu, where May entrusted her to a small group of thilashin living at the Myodan monastery. Medawati distinguished herself as a student under the direct supervision of the Myodan Sayadaw, but still, she and the other thilashin had to cook and offer meals to the monks and novices. After several years in Tangu, she asked her companions, "It's about time we moved to Sagaing. Living within the monastery, we are not free. Since we are always offering meals, our time to study is cut short. We're not making headway. Will you come with me?" The plan was well timed. Medawati and her companions would have been some of the first to travel on the new rail line connecting Tangu with Mandalay, just opened that year. The group of women included Medawati's sister, May, who had been persuaded by their uncle and brother to accompany Medawati. She growled, "This is May. Do not talk to me about suffering. My husband is dead. When I got your letter, I married off my eldest daughter. Ever since mother and father died, I've had to look after you even more than my own children." Once in Mandalay, what was intended to be a temporary stopover at the East Wifutian Monastery before continuing across the river to Sagaing turned into a 15-year stay. May lived with Medawati the entire time, cooking for her, walking her to and from the monastery for daily lessons. Medawati also became close with local donors whose offerings enabled her and her companions to live and study without going out on alms rounds. But she still wanted more. "Sister, has it been nearly 16 years that we've lived here? I feel a great deal of gratitude. Jesu nyaware. East Wifutian Sayadaw has taken such care of the 4 of us. He's looked after us so that we've never been without food, drink, and a place to stay. And he also preaches for the benefit of our donors. Do you think it would be right for us to hold an event to repay our debt of gratitude, Jesu Sepwe, before we move to Sagaing Hill? It would indeed be right. How do you want to do it? The novice monk who looks after Sayadaw has come of age. I've been wanting to sponsor his ordination. My birthday is coming up. We can do it that day." After sponsoring the ordination of this young monk, Ashintoria, in 1905, Medawati and her small group moved to Sagaing. They stayed temporarily at one of the earliest established nunneries in Sagaing Hill, where the head thilashin offered Medawati an adjacent plot of land to establish her own nunnery. After constructing a small residence called a zayat, Kimethika was officially open. Medawati and her growing group of thilashin companions cleared and leveled the ground themselves to prepare for the construction of more zayat to come. In its 4th month, Medawati's sister May was the first laywoman to initiate as a thilashin at the new nunnery. Over the course of the next several years, quote, "the number of thilashin increased just like the number of buildings," unquote. Medawati would admonish any new thilashin, "You are my daughter now. You will listen to my words. You will behave yourself." In 1910, Medawati orchestrated another almsgiving event on her birthday, one that would be celebrated annually from then on. Medawati had read in an Abhidhamma commentary, the Attasalani Atthakatha, a story about a variation of rice pudding or kheer called gavapana. Parsing a recipe from the Pali, Medawati recreated this version of kheer and served it to invited monks each year. News of Medawati's qualities, quote, "spread like a sweet smell," unquote, and pilgrims, old friends, and new donors arrived to make offerings and finance repairs and new construction. In 1912, May asked permission to return to their natal village to see her children. Medawati assented, but chose not to take the trip herself. It had been 24 years since May left home to accompany Medawati to Mandalay. Within 3 months of her return, May died of fever. About 10 years later, May's 2 youngest children, who Medawati had helped care for when she was a young girl, came to live with Medawati. The 2 stayed for less than a year before returning home. Medawati apologized. "When you came to me, I kept you according to my duty. If you are not happy, there's nothing I can do. If you cannot bear it, I will not keep you." Medawati and her early companions were the nunnery's first generation of teachers and administrators. They managed a steady stream of pilgrims, friends, and other long-term patrons. They survived a catastrophic fire in 1924 that destroyed 20 buildings. By the time of Medawati's death in 1932, the nunnery had grown from 1 zayat with 4 thilashin to 27 zayat for more than 70 thilashin, with 10 additional buildings used for classes, meditation, and events. Medawati passed away 1 week after her 70th birthday, which she celebrated with her annual giving of Gavapana. Her funeral was presided over by the monk whose ordination she had sponsored, Ashin Zoria, and attended by her teacher, Tangu Myorang Sayadaw, her donors from Mandalay, and relatives and friends from her natal village. Medawati was buried in a cave within the grounds of the nunnery. She left behind the great Kinethika nunnery that she established, for which she herself cleared away the forest. In the biographer's introduction to the volume, she expresses 2 intentions: to study and learn from the virtuous qualities, the gunas, of her teachers, and to make a historical record, a thamaim matam. Hagiography and historical reality do not often go hand in hand. However, unlike many other Buddhist biographies shaped by formulas drawn from the life of the Buddha, our biographer, Zanawati, her approach emphatically humanizes her subjects. They exhibit no supernatural powers, no extraordinary meditative attainments, and little in the way of overt charisma. Donors and construction projects do not spring miraculously from the ground. Teachers do not predict their deaths, nor offer lyrical lessons from the deathbed. Instead, the guna that Zanawati highlights is Zwelona, a Burmese compound that joins perseverance with effort, conviction with persistence. Vital to the way Zanawati demonstrates Zwelona in the biography is time. In a basic way, there can be no perseverance without time, and the historical genre of the mine serves its representation. The mine are typically terse accounts of the consecration of sacred sites and monuments, with records of donations and renovations following consecration. Zanawati's interpretation of the genre is well suited to the project of demonstrating the effort entailed in the gradual accumulation and maintenance of social relationships, credentials, resources, land, and buildings over the course of life. She says in her introduction, "Because of the unrelenting perseverance and diligence of the Seyaji of this nunnery, today Kemetaka, of a laudable and lofty position within Myanmar, is a renowned center of training with more than 100 thilashin. In other words, because of what they did, this place is here. We are here. I am here." Like Gothita, in his personal recognition of Dhammasari's effort and influence, Medawati's biographer feels herself implicated in an ongoing cumulative project of preservation and expansion. The quality of Zwelona comes into focus in gradual accumulations, in the back and forth of relationships that shift and stretch over the span of life. One of the relationships that emerges most clearly is Medawati's reliance on her sister May. The biographer Zanawati never met May, who died 7 years before Zanawati joined Kemetaka. And yet it is May's perspective and May's words that are so often and evocatively voiced throughout the biography. The sisters' relationship is intimate but strained. As young women, May tests Medawati's conviction about living as a thilashin, asking her to wait 3 years. Later, when May acquiesces to her uncle's urging to accompany Medawati to Mandalay, May does not hide her resentment. Recall her words, "Do not talk to me about suffering. I have had to look after you even more than my own children." May's departure from her children, leaving her eldest daughter to become mother for her younger siblings, echoes the death of her and Medawati's parents when May became mother to Medawati. Later, when May initiates as a thilashin upon the opening of the new nunnery, Medawati becomes mother to May. She says, "You are my daughter now. You will listen to my words." The sisters' bond is remade and reinforced by Jesu, by what they owe each other for making a certain kind of life possible. Perhaps May's unexpected passing back in her natal home among her own children left Medawati with the sense that her debt of gratitude was left painfully unpaid. After May's death, when May's children arrive on Medawati's doorstep, it's her duty to take them in, but they leave unhappy, that duty still left unfulfilled. How should we understand the biographer's imaginative labor in drawing such a portrait of May in the midst of Medawati's biography? The biographer's profound understanding of this complex relationship must have been informed by Medawati's memories, or by the memories of others who knew them both and knew them together. Recall our other monastic biographer, Gothita, in his acute recognition of a sense of debt to the benefactor of his benefactor. As Medawati's biographer comes to understand May's role in the making of Kemethica, she feels her own life implicated in May's story as much as in Medawati's story. May's presence in Medawati's biography could be read as a way of repaying personal and institutional debts of gratitude to May. It is also a rhetorical move that could appeal to both thilashin and lay readers to recognize the multiple and intersecting forms of labor that sustain Buddhist projects, and to reciprocate within the idiom of Jesu and Jesu set, debts of gratitude in their repayment. It is precisely this capacity of Jesu to remake and reinforce bonds of kinship that Medawati understands deeply and learns to harness, even as a young woman. Here, my analysis resonates with Nancy Eberhardt's approach to young boys' novice initiation rituals among Shan Buddhists in Thailand as a life course ritual for mothers to demonstrate their social capital, rather than as a rite of passage for the boys. Medawati has a deep understanding of human relationality and an intuitive sense of how to combine individual needs with institutional structures. Take again an example of Medawati's Jesu Sapwe before her departure from Mandalay to Sagaing, for which she orchestrated the ordination of her teacher's protege, Zodia, to repay her debt of gratitude to her teacher. Sponsoring the ordination of an up-and-coming monk, and doing so in a very public way, inviting all of her donors to participate, made Medawati the conduit for a prestigious act of merit-making. It strengthened her reputation for discerning foresight and generosity, tethered her to the ordaining monk as his Yahan Amma, or monk mother, an epithet for ordination sponsor, and confirmed her close relationship with their shared teacher, the Iswithoteon Sayadaw. These would be lasting bonds. When Medawati died, it was Zodia who presided over her funeral, as a son would, for she had made herself his mother. Medawati had figured out that merit-making and mothering are multi-purpose projects. When Medawati establishes Kemethica in Sagaing, she brings those multi-purpose projects within her own domain of command. The young thilashin and their physical labor to clear away shrubs and trees and level the uneven terrain readies the land for a different kind of growth. The nunnery is a place in which bonds of kinship are reworked by gratitude, Jesu, and this is vital to its endurance as an institution. The biography's description that the number of thilashin increased just like the number of buildings refers to the piecemeal development of the complex and the dispersal of its sources of support. Small groups of women and girls, often related as kin, sisters, cousins, nieces and aunts, mothers and daughters, would arrive to Kemethica and invest offerings in the construction of their own zayat. Kawanami's ethnographic research in the 1990s highlights that it is precisely this dispersal that can present challenges to the durability of nunneries. If a question of secession arises, infighting among different kin groups for control of the institution and its resources can lead to a nunnery's demise. Medawati's challenge in expanding the nunnery was to create the conditions for another mode of belonging, one that would bind this collective together as an institution that could outlive her. This is the frame in which I understand Medawati's peculiar almsgiving to celebrate her birthday by offering gavapana as a strategy of bringing and keeping people together. It's commonplace for thilashin to cook and serve monks, and to do so in grand style on their birthdays. But the biography's explicit reference to the story that inspired her calls us to think further about the ways such service can be textually prefigured and strategically performed. At a general level, in deciphering a recipe from a Pali commentary, Medawati transforms the typical work of preparing and serving food to monks into a performance of textual mastery that enhances her authority as a teacher. At another level, mixing this story into an annual ritual has particular implications for how we ought to encounter the texture of that authority, or in other words, how Medawati understood her accomplishments. Medawati comes across the story from which she called the recipe for gavapana in the introduction to a commentary that opens by recalling the Buddha's prior rebirths. In one of these rebirth stories, we meet the Buddha to be as a wealthy man named Suruchi, who hears another Buddha preaching and wants to make offerings to him and his retinue of 1,000 million monks. Suruchi knows he can afford to feed them and clothe them, but where could they possibly all sit down to eat? Sensing the chance to share in the merit Suruchi would earn by this act of giving, the god Saka disguises himself as a carpenter and constructs an extraordinary building to accommodate them all. How could Suruchi pay such a carpenter for his services? He cooks a kheer called gavapana that feeds the monks continuously for 7 days, rather than his initial plan of a single meal, expanding exponentially the merit he and Saka earned together. Saka built an extraordinary place where a sense of welcome and accommodation that at first seemed impossible became possible. Suruchi paid back his gratitude by cooking an ordinary kheer that, when offered in this extraordinary place, expanded to nourish millions. Medawati's citation of this story, calling what is otherwise a very ordinary recipe for kheer, gavapana, suggests that she is making this story into a model of practice. She and May and their group of thilashin companions came together to transform empty space into a place of belonging to accommodate whoever would come. They needed support, and by the force of their perseverance, conviction, and good intentions, their zui, they received it. Mixing rice, honey, sugar, and butter, as Medawati described in a poem she composed for the first annual event, taking ordinary elements of her social world, combining them with effort, acuity, and conviction, she creates something greater than the sum of its parts. And for that, we must be grateful. In conclusion, I want to just briefly reflect on the stakes of this biographical project for its author, Do Zanawati, the fourth successor to the role of Seyaji of Kimethika. For her, the volume of biographies is itself a multi-purpose project. Writing at the close of the 1970s, she is living in the midst of an impending reorganization of Buddhist monastic institutions at the national level. 1980 brought the establishment of the State Sangha Mahanayaka Committee, through which General Ne Win sought command over a nationalized monastic community. Institutional structures and affiliations were in flux, a fraught moment in which to celebrate Kimethika's 75th anniversary. For Zanawati, I imagine that learning from the qualities of her teachers was a way to build up a repertoire of strategies and practices with which to equip herself for an uncertain future. Her biographies offer a wide and deep view of women working through successive layers of harsh, unfavorable terrain and succeeding. I have learned from theorists of religious authority like Ismail Alatas that the durability of communities and institutions is always a product of labor, material, social, and rhetorical. Zanawati's biographies show these processes unfolding alongside a rich understanding of the complexity of ordinary human relationships, not often included in Buddhist historiography. By focusing on biographical self-representations of thilashin within their intimate social collectives, I try to draw attention to the effects of the rhetorical force of relationships. Biographies of thilashin teach us that kinship and families do not just intersect with, enable, or endanger Buddhist projects. Buddhist projects can rework bonds of kinship, and this is vital to how they endure meaningfully in the lives and afterlives of their participants. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, MK. That was great. You wanted to take questions yourself, so people can put either in chat or you can raise hand.
Sure.
If you have questions or responses to them. Thank you.
Hi, Anthony, please go ahead.
Hi, MK. Let me turn on my video. Thanks. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Thanks so much for your really fascinating presentation. And it's so exciting to hear this kind of culmination of this long project. At the end, right, you mentioned something that was really very compelling to me, which is, you know, I didn't get the exact quote, but basically that these biographies lay out and show the effects of the various labors that go into building these religious communities, right? And also the rhetorical labor, but then also the physical labor of things like making kir, building temples, things like that. And I assume you're using effects like EFF, right? But what I want to ask about the affect, right? What affects do these things produce, and what affects do they stem from? So I want you to talk about affect in addition to effect.
Okay. This is a hard question, and it's one that I am dealing with currently in my writing, is how to sort of get into the emotional force of the emotional world of my biographer, the biographer, and her subjects. And I think this is what I find so powerful about the way that, just as one example, that Medawati and her sister, that their relationship unfolds in dialogue, not just through description of what they're doing. And this has also like challenged my chops as a translator too, is to really try to get the mood, try to understand tone. And this has, you know, very slowly come from reading and rereading these dialogues, and trying to understand, especially May's perspective and what she's dealing with in her story with Medawati. And I think that's one of the reasons I really have found working with this idea of Jesu really generative, because oftentimes when we're thinking about care and support, we're talking about its provision and less about its reception. And so this idea of Jesu gives us both sides of an act performed and how we are expected to respond. And I think May shows us that it's not always easy to respond, that it can be really fraught to figure out how to be in this kind of relationship. And that speaks to the challenge that Medawati and her successors are up against in keeping an institution together, bringing 100 women together into the same space and getting them to belong within the same space, feel at home in the same space. And for that to last over 4 generations means they must be getting something right about the mood. But yeah, this is a really good question to try to work in some more of the emotional elements of the dialogues. And that's where I think more that comes in more. Yeah, thank you. Eric.
Hey, oops. It won't, my video. Can you hear me, MK?
Yes, I can hear you clearly.
The video came on. So thanks a lot. I have a lot of questions, but I'm just gonna sort of ask one. So when I was hearing you talk through the biography of the thilashin, I was thinking about different types of care and service that are embedded in these relations of indebtedness and gratitude. So it seemed like, you know, there's kinship, right? It can be parent, child, older sibling, younger sibling, other kinds of extensions. There's also sort of discipleship and training, right? Like teachers and students, preceptors, preceptees, abbots, residents of nunneries. And then I guess there's also the kinds of care and service in terms of just, I don't know how to describe it exactly, the language, especially emically, like just patrons, right? You know, providing finances and other stuff for various clients in terms of institution building and other things. And I was just wondering, to what degree if you think about these three different types, to what degree did the biographies of the thilashin reveal tensions and conflicts between these forms of indebtedness, gratitude, and problems in repaying them all adequately given conflicting roles and obligations? So that's one question. And then the other is, and I don't know if this works, is I was trying to think about when you move to the level of hagiographies, to what degree are those kinds of tensions and conflicts, how are they managed representationally, right? Are they elided, erased, displaced, you know, whatnot in terms of, but you know, that would presume being able to really map biographies versus hagiography, and that can be quite difficult practically, right? But those are just two sorts of questions I had about the biographical unfolding of debt and gratitude across the lifetime.
Yes. So your first question about revealing tensions and conflicts in these relationships. There is I'm going to stick with the biography of the founder because you guys have more of a context for that one. But there is another scene that accompanies May, the older sister, asking permission to return to their natal village to see her children. The reason that Medawati does not accompany her is that she has recently been punished by her teacher, the Mahagandayon Sayadaw, because she went on pilgrimage with another Sayadaw to India and Sri Lanka, and was away from the nunnery for too long, according to Mahagandayon Sayadaw. So, you know, there's this tension in the kind of like intercommunal politics, the intermonastic politics of the teachers and their jurisdiction over the thilashin. And so because of that punishment, Medawati felt that she couldn't leave the nunnery to go with May. And so she had to make a choice about who to follow. And in that situation, she chose to follow her teacher. And the tragedy is that on that trip, her sister dies. So I think that, you know, and this speaks to Anthony's questions about affect too. Here's this other scene of, you know, the give and take of these relationships that really demonstrates, you know, just the daily decision making and that they have to deal with to be in this many layers of relationship. That it really plays out in the daily social interactions. And that's one of the reasons I think this biography is so rich in comparison with a more hagiographical text, and even generally biographies about monks. They exclude all of that all the good stuff, all the hard stuff. As you said, how do those tensions get managed in hagiographies? I think they don't. I think that the snippets of monastic biography I've read are so, of male monastic biography, I mean, are so constrained by, idioms of lineage, by the kinds of institutional structures that they're working to maintain, that you just don't get the same sense of what it actually felt like to be doing what they were doing. And even okay, I'll leave it there. Thank you, Eric.
No, thanks.
I think there's a question from Zin in the chat. I'll just take a moment to read. Zin is asking about hierarchical relationships within the family, the natal family, and power relations within the family. This is a really great question, because I'm going to try to bring in a bit more of the broader frame of my dissertation as a whole, and refer to another chapter about the third success, Medawati's third successor. So as a whole, each chapter kind of highlights a different kind of bond that is, creating or recreating kinship in the lives of these thilashin. So this chapter is about Jesu. In another chapter, I talk about the idea of parami, which is like a core, Buddhist, generally Buddhist idea about this sort of inborn perfections, or perfections in Burma, there's sort of inborn, but the moral perfection accumulated over many lifetimes that, propels a certain person into Buddhahood or arhantship. Now, in the biography of one of Medawati's successors, there's a really fascinating story, Zin, that I think you've actually read previously in a draft, about the family of the thilashin, and the fact that she is considered by her natal family to be the rebirth of her grandmother. And it is parami that kind of is it is her parami, it was the grandmother's parami and the granddaughter's parami that makes this connection across generations, especially in a way that ends up excluding the male progenitors of the family from their family history. And so I think this is a really interesting example, basically by telling the story, telling the family history that kind of brings about a form of, family reproduction that doesn't rely on the men. And it's called parami. And so I think this is like one of the ways that I'm getting into these sort of like subaltern readings of what thilashin are doing and how they conceive of themselves within their families, how they use different, different Buddhist ideas and practices to remake those different kinds of kinship bonds. Thank you, Zin. Any other questions? Adam, please go ahead.
Oh, thank you very much indeed for this very interesting research and project field area you're looking into. You mentioned, along the way, in terms of the educational opportunities, and earlier on in their life, they were assisting the monks, and then moved on to other places in the country. So in the nunnery at the end, I just wondered whether you gleaned any information as to how far they got in really accessing, high quality educational sort of setup, sort of maybe, relative to what the monks would have, in terms of library and linguistics and, all the sort of things that the top scholar monks in Myanmar might have. I just wondered whether you had any inkling as to how, how far they managed to proceed along that way. And thank you anyway for a marvelous presentation.
Sure, thank you. Thanks for the question. Yeah, so each, in the telling of each biography, there is typically includes a little review of what they studied and with who, which is pretty common in monastic biography. And so basically all of the thilashin who are subjects of these biographies complete what would be considered the sort of standard, certainly the standard novice level of education, and then have these sort of idiosyncratic ad hoc. She read this with this monk because she got to spend a few years in this monastery, which for the time that sort of was the standard, that you would travel to a teacher to study a particular text or to study in a particular way. And depending if you had the resources to stay long enough, or if you had to go home and get your next stipend, it sort of would determine how deeply you could go into that whatever text was being taken up. So this was sort of the four biographies. When you put them in line end to end, they kind of coincide with the growing popularity of the monastic exam system. And later, by the fourth biography, by the third actually, at the end, there will be a list of how many of her students passed the exams. And by the fourth, we get the list of exams that she passed. And so there is a very interesting kind of historical arc of being able to watch how the exams did start to have an effect on the way that they were accessing education and the standardization of that education over time. But before that, in the first two biographies, there's no mention at all of the examination system. And rather, there is this sort of idiosyncratic and cumulative educational project. And what's kind of interesting about that, I think, to think about the way that Medawati, the founder, was reading this Abhidhamma commentary, the Atasani, Atakata, which would probably, she had to have some pretty good Pali chops to sit down with that text. So we know that she read and composed in Pali. She is reading that text at a time when Abhidhamma education and Abhidhamma learning was also undergoing a transformation, like under the kinds of more popular training texts from Lady Sayadaw and teachers like him, who were trying to bring Abhidhamma learning, make it more accessible for lay people. But what's interesting is that her reading of that text doesn't really coincide with the way that these teachers were trying to get people to access those texts. She's not reading through the lens of a primer, and her reading has nothing to do with Abhidhamma categories. It has everything to do with this recipe for kheer that's in the introduction, which even the modern translator, Ben Montin, he ignores it. He doesn't even put it in his translation. So, you know, she clearly has her own style of reading this text. And I think that, you know, that could be a result of a non-standard education, maybe also reading for enjoyment or reading whatever is there. Maybe she's partially, you know, training herself with the resources at hand, and making what she will of them on her with her own readings too. So yeah, great question. Thank you, Adam. And Ik, I think you are next.
Thank you so much, MK, for your talk. And I need to apologize first in advance because I'm joining in late. So I might ask you some questions that you already addressed in your talk. So I need to apologize in advance. So I have two questions for you. The first one is about the difference between biography and autobiography. So I'm wondering if you have encountered some autobiography, because from what I observed from the Buddhist biographies, at least in Thailand, mostly written by the followers or the disciples. But we can also think about the autobiography, which is way back into 19th century, like of Vajrayana, right? That's Craig Reynolds translated. So for your case studies about the non-biographies, I'm wondering if you have ever encountered the autobiography of the nuns, and how would that be different from general biographies, which are written by their followers? That's my first question. Then the second question, I'm interested in food, right? So I'm wondering how the recipes of the kheer in the nuns' biography would be different from the way they tell us about the food recipes in other genre of books.
Sure.
Yeah.
So your first question, yeah, it's a good question, because the fourth biography in the volume I'm working with is an autobiography. The fourth head teacher wrote all four, so the last one is her autobiography. And it's interesting because she writes it in exactly the same tone, and she writes in the third person. And so I think she's going for some level of uniformity across all four, except in hers, we get a whole lot more extra detail of her family history. She starts 2 generations prior to her. So I think it's like she called mom and was like, tell me all the stories, and she put them all in her autobiography. She includes her earliest memory, which is of getting lost in a pilgrimage, on a pilgrimage with her family and being found, and it's a very rhetorical story of she was just so worried that if she never made it back to her family, that she wouldn't be able to start 4th grade on time. And she's part of her building up her aura of being a very academically minded young woman. But yeah, so far that's sort of like the main difference I found between those. And I'm still working on my analysis of that autobiography. So more to come there. And your second question was about kheer. No, I wouldn't say there's like anything special to say about the way the recipe is encountered. And, it's, I don't know, it's weird that it's in the Atasani Antakata. Why is there a recipe? So yeah, it's a good question, but I'm not sure whether, has anyone else ever cooked it from the Pali or not? I don't know, but it's fun. But we're running out of time, and I don't want to miss the chance for Anne's question. So please, Anne.
Okay, thank you.
MK, I'm happy to defer because you and I fortunately have the opportunities to discuss often. So if you want to take further discussion from our colleague in Madison, please do.
Well, it's okay. I don't know. Are you burning with more questions, Ik? Okay.
I'm just curious about food because I'm
Okay.
kind of curious if in this non-biography would say something. For example, this is just my assumption. Like they would tell us the details of how to prepare kheer properly, which is quite different from general way of cooking like that. Yeah. Like tie it into ways of meditation or whatever. Yeah. Or cooking with mindfulness like that.
Yeah, no. There's no instructions on how to cook. She reproduces her translation of the recipe, and that's it. So, but yeah, there's no extra detail about. Yeah, I guess, but the only like extra tidbit we get about it was that the smell of Gavapana, the smell of the special cure, is something that draws people in, and that it's sort of one of the ways that her qualities became known, is because of the way the smell wafted around. But yeah, otherwise, no, there's no specific instructions for proper preparation. Thanks, Ik.
Thank you. That's fascinating.
Hi, MK. I don't know if we still have time, and I'm not even sure if my question is really super relevant in terms of where you want to go next, so don't feel any pressure to take it. But the way you set up the talk today, which I thoroughly enjoyed, and I'm excited always to see this project emerging in its fullness. The way you set it up today, ending with by beginning to talk a little bit about the kind of Sangha context for the final publication of the biographies / autobiography. Since you left us there in this talk, and also both in this talk and in some other work you've presented recently, you've been talking a little bit about these Shuijin connections. I started to wonder, and again, I'm asking here from kind of very substantial ignorance, what if anything you would want us to know about where the Shuijin stand in the monastic reorganizations that are occurring in the kind of first third of the 20th century? Is that relevant at all? Is there anything that is kind of lineage particular that we would want to have in mind at this time, or not? Again, I'm not quite sure of the relevance of this. That question came into my mind today in terms of kind of where you left us historically towards the end. I benefited from the talk overall a lot, MK. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. Yes, I left out all the Shuijin stuff because I thought I would run out of time, but it turns out I would have had the time for it, I think. So thank you for the opportunity to bring it in. So yes, this is one of the directions that I'm taking the dissertation in these final stages of writing, is really trying to understand, I'm drawing out these different strategies of bringing people into the nunnery, of inviting support. But do those strategies have limits? What are the boundaries of that kind of these different forms of belonging? And how can I get at those in the biography? And so one of the ways I'm trying to do that is by looking for these cues of, which communities are we talking about, which particular teachers and which groups of patrons and devotees might see a name in the biography and think, I respect that monk and he respects her, so I should, get on board with this project. And so certainly for this nunnery, teachers in the Shuijin Gain are, the tops. I think this is really interesting because the biographer also goes to great lengths to name them all in her introduction, to give a kind of lineage of Shuijin teachers who have supported thilashin in general and this nunnery in particular. And so even though, you know, thilashin would not purport to belong to the Shuijin Gain, those relationships are the ones that have been the most beneficial for thilashin. The institutional support of Shuijin teachers, without that, they generally, these institutions would have struggled. In terms of getting education, as Adam asked about, and also in terms of, you know, relying on these relationships of support in order to kind of lock into these different patronage collectives. So by participating in the patronage collectives of a certain teacher, these thilashin would have also forged their own relationships with other patrons and devotees who recognized each other. And I think it's most explicit in the biography of Medawati's partner nun and successor, who is from Tangmu City, and her family. Some of you might have noticed in her portrait, which I'm not going to take the time to bring back up, she's listed as the benefactor or the ordination sponsor of the Tanggu Nyoran Sayadaw. So her family built his monastery, and her parents' dying wish was, don't lose the connection with the monastery. And so it was extremely important for this family to have that connection and to maintain that connection. And it's one that pops up again and again in the two first biographies of different, you know, the first time the thilashin traveled to Sagaing, and they meet some people on the ferry who are like, oh, you must be from Tangmu. Like, you're so refined and beautiful. Oh, we have the same teacher. And that's one way that they get these patrons. So that affiliation to a specific Shuijin monk, specifically in Tangmu, becomes very significant in the early stages of the nunnery. And this is a great way, despite that kind of national level reorganization of the Sangha that's going on, there's still these really important, very local, very intimate kinds of relationships. And those are the ones that matter for the thilashin and for this institution. And it's harder to see those, to go back to this contrast between biography and hagiography, or even a sort of gendered contrast in biography. It's harder to see those local, intimate collectives in biographies about men and monks, but they're right up front and very powerful in these biographies of thilashin.
That's great, MK, really helpful and interesting. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, MK. That was a really interesting presentation and discussion. I think I learned a lot. That's what we've got time for today. But yeah, thank you again, everyone, for joining and having this discussion with us.
Thank you so much, everyone, for coming.